Hi, I'm David Hamburger, and in this lesson, we're going to look at improving your soloing by using motivic development. Now, motivic means using motives or little ideas, and developing them means taking those little ideas and seeing what you can do with them. The idea is to create a solo that, on the one hand, has a certain kind of connectedness and unity to it because it's based around some related ideas instead of just being whatever lick you happen to come up with at the moment, and to make sure that you can always have something to play because you know how to take whatever the first few ideas you come up with, whatever those first couple of ideas are, you have ways to sort of draw them out, use them, reuse them, and turn them around in a way that makes sense. So it's just a kind of efficient musical way of looking at taking your ideas and building them into an entire solo. So we could take something really simple like this, which is a lick that I've been using throughout many of the lessons in this series, and then see where we're going to end up with it. Now, one of the simplest things you can do, and something that I talked about during the playing into the downbeat lesson, is to take a short idea and then turn it into a longer one. So starting with a short phrase that starts on, in this case, the and of 3, 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1. And then turning it into a longer one, starting on the and of 1. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1. Now you could do that with any kind of starting point if it's basically a pentatonic lick sort of idea and it revolves around the root. So let's say we did that. So all I'm doing is taking the first few notes and then I'm repeating them. And extending it, but still resolving back to the root, back to E. And so even just within those last two phrases, I resolved it two different ways. But that's one way to do it. So you're just going up, root, flat third, fifth, flat third, fourth. And because of the nature of the way the pentatonic scale lies over both the 1 and the 4 chord, ideas like this will work over either the E or the A chord. And with a simple idea like that, you could also incorporate a bit of chord voicing action as well, which is something that I talked about in both the chords up the neck lesson and the chord hits lesson. So you might land on this note right on the downbeat of the first bar, and you could support it with a chord voicing that includes that note. And you could answer that with an echo resolution, which is something I talked about in an earlier lesson as well. So maybe something like that, where you just do a bit of a double stop as an answer to the phrase that you've played. And then you could go through this, with whatever you started off with, taking short phrases, building them into longer phrases, and creating that kind of call and response between the first bar and the third bar of each line, or certainly of the first 2 lines of the blues. Things are a little different when you get to the turnaround. But so you can start by just finding fragments. And this one's tricky, right? Because if you play a major third over the 1 chord, it might sound a little weird over the 4 chord. So maybe you avoid that at first, or you do something like this up in this register. Right? So there's the major third. So there we're turning the major third on the E chord into the flat 7 of the 4 chord. So and you can come back to the major third when you get back. So again, that's an example of how a lick could end a few different ways. If this is your opening thing, where can you go from there? Start with the first few notes again. Can you go up? Can you resolve it to the major third? Can you resolve it to the root? Can you just keep going down? You can come back to the major third down here. So and then some kind of chord answer to all of that. Same thing when you're on the 4 chord. Maybe you play flat third of E as you're on your way into the 4 chord. Maybe a quick double stop there, the chord answer to your short phrase. And then answer it like that. So whatever you start with, or you see where you can go by taking that short phrase and where you can land with it. So that's taking short phrases and turning them into longer phrases, and also maybe landing on a chord, supporting that idea when you get there. So maybe you find a way to land on a strong moment and support that with this chord. So it's an A add 9 voicing. And of course, these chord responses could be anything, any of the things that I've talked about in previous lessons about that. So that's taking a short phrase and making it longer, and looking at having sort of a common idea between the two phrases, the shorter one and the longer one. You could also start with a longer phrase and then shorten it. So if you start with, right, so 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1. And now you've got something that you can change by making it shorter. Only one note shorter, but you feel it as a restatement with a variation. So just landing right on the downbeat when you get to the top of measure 3. Now you could also make it even shorter. That's really effective too. So any kind of longer phrase you start with, now I'm sort of describing the back half of that phrase, right? So just this part. So we totally avoid the whole issue of what happens to that major third when you're on the A chord, and we basically just play the back half of the opening lick, and so it feels connected. It feels like a variation, and it leaves room for some chord hits if you want them. So once you have that shorter lick, working over the first 4 bars. Right, now you can have the major third in the kickoff because you're still on the E chord. And then grab the flat third on the A chord. Grabbing the back half of the lick again, and then there's the major third. So listen to how that sounds over the whole first 8 bars. And then where are you going to go? Into the turnaround. You can have the same rhythm. You want to adapt it for the notes of the B7 chord, so you can have this and then get to the 5th of the B instead of trying to slide up to here. A slight variation that's bluesier, has the same rhythm, but a slightly different set of notes to get you back to the E, to the E chord. I was trying to play and think at the same time. That's never a good idea. So these are 2 different models for how to do it. Short phrase answered by a long phrase, and then longer phrase that gets kind of truncated. Now, another thing you can do, a third option, is to, and this works well when you're sort of a little further into your solo. If you've done one of these 2 approaches, you may find yourself finishing up with a short phrase. And you might sort of chain the different choruses, the different successive times through the 12-bar progression. You can sort of chain those together by grabbing the last thing you played in the previous chorus and using that as a repetitive idea for the first 4 bars of the next chorus. So if we had this idea, last thing we had was that idea. And so by sort of sliding around where it lands, instead of playing it as a phrase into the downbeat, we could play it right on the downbeat. So with a little rhythmic variation, but those basic notes, and repeat that over the first 4 bars. Play a shorter version of that, so even shorter than, right? So, and you've heard this a million times, it's a way to build intensity on a solo, is this use of repetition, which then gets resolved as you get to bar 5. So a couple things happen there. We have that repetition for 4 times. We play an even shorter version of the lick as we get into bar 5. And then we use that as the springboard for a short, long resolution. So we landed on A, bar 5, and then bar 6. So now we're back to this initial idea of a short phrase that gets developed into a longer phrase. So you can use these in different ways, and these ideas of shortening and lengthening your phrases can be used in different places in the solo with a different kind of effect. So after doing this repetition, now we come back in and we make use of this short long tool. It's just like having another voicing or another lick in your vocabulary to have this idea of short long, as opposed to this idea of repeating something for 4 bars and then resolving it. And so within this idea of, we could repeat it exactly the same 4 times. Or in those first 4 bars of the chorus, we could use one of these same tools. We could take that lick and then shorten it by 1 note. And then And then we could take it and make it even longer by chaining a few versions of it together. So we could have... So now we've got this whole statement of a phrase, a shorter version, and then a longer version of that. So... So it makes this big 4-bar arc that's very suspenseful and then lands on bar 4. And then still has some place to go, right? Because we've just done that. So now we can grab that and resolve it. So by going from idea to idea and by having like a few different tools for how to repurpose each idea, you have a way to start with one short fragment and build it out, bring it down, use some repetition, move things around, put in a few chord hits, and create, this ongoing sort of narrative way of playing through the choruses that you're playing, because everything is sort of connected to the last thing, everything's sort of leading you into the next thing, and it's a very musical and, very sort of storytelling way of playing that is more than just saying, well, I think I'll play this lick, and then I'll play that lick, and then I think I remember how to play this lick. Instead, you're taking some very simple elements musically as far as what note choices you have. We haven't even gone outside of just the basics of minor and maybe a little bit of major pentatonic, and yet we can create this, 3-chorus adventure, that goes through a few choruses and keeps developing and keeps changing a little bit. So just taking a short fragment, we can construct this whole thing. And you don't have to memorize licks. You just have to memorize the idea of using this kind of rhythmic and motivic development. So one more time, we could start with something like this. Let's see. And along the way, you are going to maybe land on or pull in some familiar licks. Like you get to the turnaround, maybe you play a B7 lick you're familiar with. And it may not be completely motivically related, but that will also provide a kind of contrast. Like, oh, we sort of broke that for a moment, and now we're back when we get back to the 1 chord or whatever it is. So I hope that gives you some ideas to keep developing your improvising with. If you'd like more ideas about how to improvise and how to create these kind of schemes for having more sort of organized and musically satisfying improvisation, you can learn more about that over at my website, fretboardconfidential.com, and I'll see you in the next lesson.